Imagine an empire, a civilization of millions, with a capital city more spectacular than any in Europe, a metropolis built on water, gleaming with pyramids that touch the clouds, a testament to immense power and divine favor. Now, imagine it all turning to dust in less than 2 years. How does a superpower, forged over a century of conquest, simply vanish? This isn't just a story of a clash of civilizations. It is a story of a fatal flaw, a crack in the very foundation of an empire so deep that it was destined to shatter. To understand how it all came tumbling down, we must first understand how it was built. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because you will not want to miss a moment of this incredible story of pride, prophecy, and the politics of fear. Let us journey back to the Valley of Mexico, long before the Spanish sails appeared on the horizon. The people we call the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, were not always masters of this world. They were newcomers, wanderers, mercenaries for hire with a fearsome reputation and a demanding god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south. They were the ultimate underdogs who, through sheer will and brutal strategy, built their staggering city, Tenochtitlan, in the middle of Lake Texcoco. From this island fortress, their influence spread like a bloodstain on a map. But this was no benevolent union of states. What the Mexica built was less an empire and more a protection racket on a continental scale, and they ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in obsidian. The engine of their dominion was tribute. As we walk through the ghost of the great Tlatelolco market, we can almost see the endless streams of goods flowing into the capital from every corner of their vast domain. We are not just talking about gold, jade, and exotic feathers for the emperor's cloaks. We are talking about everything: food to feed the teeming population of Tenochtitlan, textiles, pottery, raw materials. The vassal states were bled dry to fuel the splendor of their masters. Failure to pay this tribute was met with swift and horrifying retribution. An entire town could be put to the sword as a message to its neighbors. The Mexica perfected the art of making an example. But the most terrifying tribute of all was human. To appease their gods, the Mexica believed they had to offer the most precious thing of all, human hearts, and they required them in staggering numbers. The Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor, was a place of constant ceremony and sacrifice. Here, we witness the darkest aspect of their rule. These were not just religious rites, they were calculated acts of political theater. Every captive warrior, every person sent as tribute who was marched up those temple steps, was a symbol of Mexica dominance. Their deaths were a broadcast to the hundreds of subjugated tribes, a chilling reminder of who was in charge and the price of defiance. To ensure a steady supply of victims, the Mexica even institutionalized a unique and terrible form of conflict: the Flower Wars. These were not wars of conquest, fought for land or resources. They were prearranged, ritualistic battles with neighboring states, like the fiercely independent Tlaxcalans, for the sole purpose of capturing warriors alive. Imagine being a young man in a Tlaxcalan village, knowing that at any moment you might be called to fight a battle you were not meant to win, but to be harvested in. This constant threat, this looming promise of a gruesome death far from home, bred a deep and simmering hatred. Here we find the fatal flaw in the Aztec design. Fear can build an empire, but it cannot buy loyalty. Across the land, in Tlaxcala, in Totonac towns along the coast, in every place that sent its sons and its wealth to Tenochtitlan, an ocean of resentment was quietly rising. The empire was a pyramid of skulls, perfectly balanced and waiting for a single unforeseen tremor to bring it all crashing down. The survivors of that terrible night were a ghost of an army, a column of walking wounded limping away from the city that had so thoroughly broken them. Let us follow them on their agonizing retreat, stumbling through the rain-slicked mud, hounded at every step by Mexica's skirmishers. The gleam of stolen gold was gone, replaced by the dull sheen of blood on tattered armor. Cortés himself, we are told, wept beneath a great ahuehuet tree, not for the lost treasure, but for the lost men. In Tenochtitlan, a grim and triumphant celebration was underway. The captured Spaniards were sacrificed atop the Templo Mayor in full view of their retreating comrades, their hearts offered to Huitzilopochtli as thanks for a victory that seemed absolute. The strange invaders had been expelled. The universe, it seemed, had been righted. But as the Mexica cleared their canals of bloated corpses and celebrated their new, fiercely anti-Spanish leader, Cuitlahuac, an enemy far more insidious than any Spaniard had already breached their walls. It had arrived silently, not on a war horse, but in the lungs of an African slave who was part of the Narvaez expedition. It carried no sword and wore no armor, yet it would prove to be the most lethal conquistador of them all. We are speaking of smallpox. To a population with no inherited immunity, it was not a disease. It was a biological firestorm. We can only imagine the initial confusion, the strange fevers, followed by the terrifying eruption of pustules that covered the body from head to toe. Here we witness a tragedy on a scale that defies comprehension. Within weeks, the victorious city of Tenochtitlan became a charnel house. The illness moved through the population with terrifying speed, respecting no class or station. It struck down warriors in their prime, priests in their temples, and mothers nursing their children. We can almost feel the city's vibrant hum silenced, replaced by a chorus of moans and the overwhelming stench of death. There was no one to grind the maize, no one to bring food from the chinampas. People starved in their own homes, too weak to move, their bodies a mass of weeping sores. The social fabric of the empire, woven over a century, disintegrated in a matter of months. Entire families were wiped out in a few days. So many died so quickly that the living could not bury the dead, and houses were simply collapsed over the bodies to serve as tombs. While this invisible ally waged war on his behalf, Cortés found sanctuary in the unshakable loyalty of Tlaxcala. Here, the Spaniards were not seen as defeated invaders, but as battle-proven allies who had finally suffered at the hands of their shared enemy. Their wounds were tended, their spirits restored. The Tlaxcalans, while not entirely immune to the new diseases, were spared the apocalyptic devastation that consumed the valley. They saw the plague not as a random tragedy, but as a divine sign, a weakening of the Mexica gods. They redoubled their support, providing thousands of fresh warriors and the logistical base for a new campaign. The Spaniards, with reinforcements from the coast, began to build a fleet of ships in pieces to be carried over the mountains and reassembled for a final siege of the island city. Back in Tenochtitlan, the plague claimed its most important victim. Cuitlahuac, the warrior emperor who had driven the Spaniards out, ruled for only 80 days before the sickness took him. His death was a catastrophic blow to Mexican morale, a clear signal that even the revered speaker was not safe. A new, young emperor was chosen, the brave but untested Cuauhtémoc. He inherited not an empire at the height of its power, but a city of ghosts, its armies hollowed out, its population decimated and terrified. The joyous war drums that had celebrated the expulsion of the Spaniards had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet that hung over the lake. The once mighty capital was now a floating graveyard, waiting for the return of an enemy who now knew with absolute certainty that he could not possibly lose. The sound that broke the lake's eerie quiet was not the drum of war, but the rhythm of creation. Let us now stand in the forests of Tlaxcala, far from the water, where a miracle of logistics and vengeance is taking shape. Here we can almost feel the ground shake under the efforts of thousands. Spanish shipwrights, their skills honed in the dockyards of Seville, direct a massive workforce of Tlaxcalan carpenters and laborers. They are constructing a fleet, 13 brigantines, designed to dominate the lake that had protected their enemy for so long. Once finished, these vessels were taken apart, piece by numbered piece, and carried over 50 miles of punishing mountain terrain on the shoulders of 8,000 porters. It was a Herculean feat, a testament to an alliance now fused into a single unstoppable engine of destruction. By May of the year 1521, the fleet was reassembled and launched upon the waters of Lake Texcoco. We can see them now, their sails catching the thin mountain air, their cannons gleaming. They were floating fortresses, bristling with a power the Mexica had never before witnessed. The first naval engagement was a swift and brutal affair. The Mexica war canoes, thousands of them, swarmed out to meet this new threat, but they were no match for the cannon fire and musket volleys that tore through their wooden hulls. Control of the lake was seized in a single afternoon. With their navy established, the Allied forces moved to sever the city's lifelines. The three great causeways were stormed and captured. The aqueduct of Chapultepec, carrying the city's only source of fresh water, was shattered. Tenochtitlan was no longer a capital. It had become an island prison. What followed was not a swift assault, but a slow, agonizing strangulation that lasted for more than 90 days. We witnessed the city's transformation from a jewel of civilization into a living hell. The fighting was a brutal, intimate affair that took place causeway by causeway, house by house. Each day, the Spaniards and their allies would fight their way into the city, only to be driven back at night by ferocious Mexica counterattacks. The young Emperor Cuauhtémoc proved to be a brilliant and inspirational leader, his warriors fighting with a desperate courage born of the knowledge that surrender was not an option. They turned every rooftop into a fortress, every canal into a deadly trap, ambushing the invaders from canoes that darted through the city's watery veins. Cortés, realizing he could not simply occupy the city, adopted a new and terrible strategy. His forces would advance, and everything they captured, they would destroy. We are watching the systematic demolition of one of the world's great cities. Palaces were torn down, temples burned, canals filled with the rubble of the very buildings that had made Tenochtitlan magnificent. This was a war of attrition where the Tlaxcalans and other allies unleashed their pent-up fury with shocking violence, taking a terrible revenge for generations of oppression. The Spaniards fought to capture a city and its gold. Their allies fought to erase it from the face of the earth. Inside the besieged capital, famine and thirst now waged a war more terrible than any blade. The people ate lizards, weeds, and the leather from their own shields. The water in the canals grew brackish and was fouled with the bodies of the dead. Yet, they refused to yield. Each night, from across the water, the besieging army would hear the doleful sound of the great temple drum and see the fires of sacrifice light up the sky. They were forced to watch as their captured comrades were marched up the steps of the Templo Mayor, their chests carved open in a final defiant offering to the gods who seemed to have abandoned them. The city was dying, but it was determined to take its enemies with it. The grim spectacle of sacrifice from atop the pyramid was not a deterrent. It was an unholy baptism. For the 80,000 indigenous allies now swarming the causeways, each captured Spaniard's death was a distant tragedy, but each defiant drumbeat from the temple was a personal insult, a reminder of a century of their own people's hearts being offered to these same gods. Here we see a dynamic that Cortés himself could barely control. He may have been the general, but the soul of this war now belonged to the Tlaxcalans and their confederates. They were not liberating a city. They were conducting an exorcism with fire and obsidian. Let us shift our focus from the Spanish captains to a Tlaxcalan warrior, his face a mask of ochre and black paint, his macuahuitl stained with the grime of weeks of street fighting. For him, the rubble filling the canals is not the destruction of a great city. It is justice. Every toppled statue of a Mexica god is a headstone for a grandfather captured in a flower war. As we follow his squadron through the skeletal remains of what was once a grand avenue, we can discern the two very different wars being fought. The Spaniards search methodically for gold and defensible positions. The Tlaxcalans, however, engage in a symphony of destruction. They tear down intricate featherwork. They shatter priceless pottery. They set fire to the codices that hold the memory of their enemies. They are erasing the very identity of their oppressors from the world. This wave of retributive fury was Cortés's most terrifying and essential weapon. We observe him on the causeway, watching as his allies surge past him into the city's dying heart, a torrent of vengeance he had unleashed but could no longer command. His commands to preserve certain buildings or to take prisoners were often lost in the roar of a hatred he could not comprehend. The Tlaxcalans had no interest in capturing a new vassal state for a Spanish king. They were here to ensure that Tenochtitlan would never again demand a single drop of their blood, a single grain of their maize. The Spanish fought for a future. The Tlaxcalans were settling the past. By the beginning of August, the battlefield had shrunk to the northern district of Tlatelolco. Here, the last remnants of the Mexica people, under the command of the indomitable Cuauhtémoc, made their final stand. We are now witnesses to human endurance pushed beyond all imaginable limits. The defenders were no longer warriors. They were ghosts clad in rags, armed with the courage of the doomed. They fought from rooftops and from behind barricades of their own dead, their ranks thinned by starvation as much as by enemy blades. The stench of death hung over the entire valley, a suffocating shroud that promised only one possible end. On the 13th of August, 1521, the final assault began. There was no grand strategy left, only a final brutal push into the last pocket of resistance. The war for the city was about to end, not with a treaty, but with a terrible and final silence. The final day dawned not with the sun's light, but with the shadow of 1,000 circling birds, messengers of the end. We are now standing in the ruins of Tlatelolco, a place that had been one of the world's most vibrant marketplaces, now reduced to a labyrinth of sorrow and ruin. The final push was less a battle and more a somber conclusion. The Allied forces, a tidal wave of Tlaxcalans, Texocans, and Spaniards, poured into this last pocket of resistance. What they found were not armies, but specters. We see the last of the eagle and jaguar knights, men who were once the embodiment of imperial might. Now they are shadows of their former selves, so weakened by the long siege they are barely standing, their gaunt faces marked with clay and an unyielding defiance. They fight with the energy of pure spirit, their physical strength having faded long ago. Their weapons are no longer the obsidian-edged macuahuitl, most of which have been broken, but rocks, broken rooftop beams, and the resilience of a people with absolutely nothing left to lose. The conflict is intimate, a series of desperate struggles in the shells of emptied houses and atop pyramids of rubble. A weakened Mexica warrior, armed with a sharpened stick, confronts a Tlaxcalan clad in captured Spanish armor. There is no grand strategy here, only survival measured in heartbeats. We can almost hear the whispered orders from Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, a commander who has overseen 93 days of constant soul-wearying conflict. His objective is no longer to win, but to save what little remains, to escape, to regroup, to continue their story from the mainland. He is the last living symbol of his world, and his capture would mean its final breath. Let us turn our eyes to the lake, to the murky waters which now bear the heavy signs of the long siege. The surface is quiet, reflecting the ruins of the city. A few large war canoes, painted with the insignia of the emperor, are being launched from a hidden inlet. On one of them is Cuauhtémoc, his family, and his chief counselors. It is a desperate gamble, a flight across the water while the last of his warriors buy him time with their final stand. But the lake is no longer a sanctuary. A Spanish brigantine, captained by a man named Garcia Holguin, spots the royal flotilla. Its sail catches the wind, and the pursuit is swift and determined. The small boat, powered by paddles, has no hope of outrunning the European vessel. Warning shots are fired from the ship, and soon it looms over the emperor's canoe. The warriors on board raise their shields, preparing to make their last defense for their lord. But Cuauhtémoc knows the fight is over. He stands, a figure of immense dignity amid the squalor of his defeat, and commands his men to lower their weapons. He has a final duty to perform. We are there on the deck of the Spanish ship as he is brought before the captain. He is not a cowering captive. He is still the Huey Tlatoani. He asks only to be taken directly to the supreme commander, to the man they call Malintzin, Hernán Cortés. When he finally stands before his conqueror, there is no plea for mercy. The city behind him has fallen silent for the first time in 3 months. The conflict is done. Looking Cortés in the eye, the last emperor of the Mexica touches the dagger in the Spaniard's belt. He speaks, his voice not breaking, with the authority of a king who has lost everything but his honor. I have done all that I was obliged to do to defend my city and my people. Now do with me what you will. Take this dagger and do what must be done. But Hernán Cortés was not in the business of granting noble deaths. He was in the business of profit. A martyred emperor was a powerful symbol for his enemies. A living emperor, however, was a potential source of information. Cuauhtémoc's request was ignored. The dagger remained in the Spaniard's belt. Instead, the last revered speaker was placed under guard, his royal dignity now just another asset to be leveraged. The silence that fell over the ruins was not one of peace, but of profound and absolute exhaustion. For the first time in 93 days, the air was not filled with the screams of the dying, the roar of battle, or the mournful beat of the serpent skin drum. It was filled only with the stench of death, a thick, sweet miasma that clung to everything and everyone. Here we are, standing amidst the victors on what was once the grand plaza of Tlatelolco, and we see that victory has many faces. For the Tlaxcalans, it is a grim, quiet satisfaction. They wander through the wreckage, their faces unreadable, kicking at the rubble that was once the heart of their tormentors. Their war is over. Their revenge is complete. For the Spanish soldiers, however, the war has just entered a new and frustrating phase. They poke through the ruins with their sword tips, their eyes hungry. They came here for gold, for the promised riches of a conquered empire. What they found was a city of corpses and rubble, its legendary treasury vanished. The vast fortune melted down before La Noche Triste. The treasure that had weighed down so many of their comrades to a watery grave was gone. The pressure on Cortés became immense. His men, on the verge of mutiny, wanted their payment in blood and gold. This leads us to a scene of unspeakable cruelty, a final shameful chapter in the story of the last emperor. Cuauhtémoc and the lord of the allied city of Tacuba were brought before the Spanish captains. They were questioned about the location of the treasure. When they insisted it was lost, sunk to the bottom of the lake, their words were met with fire. We now witness the emperor of what was the most powerful nation in this world, his feet and hands bound, being held over a burning brazier. His soles blistered and burned, yet he uttered no sound, no cry for mercy. The lord of Tacuba, suffering the same fate beside him, began to moan in agony. Cuauhtémoc is said to have merely turned his head and asked him with a voice of cold irony, "Do you think I am in some kind of bath or delight?" He revealed nothing. With no great treasure to be found, the final act of conquest began, the systematic erasure of a civilization. Let us watch as the very heart of their cosmos is dismantled, stone by sacred stone. The great pyramids of the Templo Mayor, which had once scraped the sky, were torn down. Their brilliantly colored blocks, once consecrated with the blood of thousands, were used as the foundation stones for a new building, a Catholic cathedral. For every carved stone pulled from the temple and placed in the wall of a church was a statement. One god was being buried to build a house for another. The canals, the city's shimmering arteries, were filled in with the debris of the palaces that once lined their banks. The great capital of Tenochtitlan was officially renamed Mexico City. And what of the allies, the thousands of warriors who had made this victory possible? The Tlaxcalans, the architects of this destruction, soon discovered a bitter truth. They had been the key that unlocked the door, but they would not be invited to the feast. They were granted certain privileges, a temporary exemption from tribute, a measure of autonomy. But they were now subjects of a new power, one with technology and a global reach they could not match. They had helped to destroy one master only to find themselves servants of another, their fierce independence traded for a pat on the head and a footnote in a Spaniard's chronicle. The foundations of New Spain were laid not upon solid ground, but on the dust of a dead civilization and the echoes of a promise that had been savagely broken. The ashes of Tenochtitlan settled into the mud, a gray paste that was equal parts crushed limestone, human bone, and forgotten glory. The new world, born from the old one's corpse, began to take a shape that was brutally unfamiliar. Here we are left not with a question of what happened, but of why. Why did a superstructure of such immense power, a civilization that could command the resources of millions and build a city in a lake, prove to be so fragile? The answer was not in the Spaniards' steel, nor in their horses, nor even in the invisible plague that did their work for them. The answer was in the very mortar that held the empire together. Let us zoom out from the smoldering ruins and view the empire as its builders did, as a great pyramid. It was a marvel of social engineering, its every layer perfectly placed. But as we look closer, we see its foundation was not solid stone. It was built upon a loose collection of resentments, a subsoil of simmering hatred that shifted with every demand for tribute, with every young warrior dragged away for the sacrificial stone. The Mexica had built a monument to fear. They believed that by making their subjects terrified, they had made them compliant. What they had actually done was make them desperate for an alternative, for any alternative. They had perfected the art of making enemies, but had never once learned the craft of making friends. Hernán Cortés was not a god, nor was he the greatest general of his age. He was a gambler who arrived at a table that was already rigged to collapse. We can see him now not as a conqueror, but as a fulcrum. He did not provide the force that toppled the empire. He simply provided the point of leverage. The immense weight of 100 oppressed nations did the rest. The Totonacs, the Tlaxcalans, and countless others did not see the Spaniards as new masters. They saw them as a divine calamity visited upon their common enemy. They joined the Spanish cause not out of a desire for a new king, but out of an apocalyptic need to see Tenochtitlan burn. Cortés did not conquer an empire. He merely held the torch and watched as the empire's own subjects doused it in gasoline. What we are left with is a profound and terrible irony. The Flower Wars, designed to project strength and supply the gods, created battle-hardened neighbors consumed with a singular lust for revenge. The tribute system, designed to enrich the capital, hollowed out the provinces and filled them with a loathing that was patient and absolute. Moctezuma's own paralysis, his inability to act decisively, was the ultimate product of a system that taught him to listen for the will of the gods, but never to the voices of the governed. Every institution designed to preserve Mexica power was a slow-acting poison, weakening the imperial body from within, making it fatally susceptible to the slightest external shock. So the pyramid of fear crumbled. The empire, built on the subjugation of hundreds of tribes, fell because those very tribes seized their first and only chance for retribution. The civilization that ruled by the knife perished when that knife was finally turned against it. It is a timeless lesson about the nature of power. An edifice built on terror alone is brittle. It can be shattered by a single, well-placed stone. Could this story have ended differently? Was there a moment when the Mexica could have chosen a different path, a path of alliance instead of domination? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to our channel and activate all notifications. That pyramid of skulls was not just a metaphor, it had a physical heart. Let us now glide across the waters of Lake Texcoco, approaching the source of all that fear and splendor. We are on one of the great causeways, broad and straight as a ruler's decree, leading to the capital, Tenochtitlan. It does not rise from the water so much as it commands it. This is not merely a city. It is an audacious statement of power, a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 souls built on a man-made island. Canals serve as its streets, plied by thousands of canoes carrying goods and people. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and chili, hums with the energy of a living organism. Towers and temples, their stucco walls painted in brilliant reds and whites, seem to challenge the sun itself. It is the Venice of the Americas, but grander, fiercer, and infinitely more precarious. At its very center we find the sacred precinct, a vast walled square, the spiritual and political nexus of the known world, and dominating everything, casting a long shadow over every home and marketplace, is the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. It is a stepped pyramid with two shrines at its summit, one for Tlaloc, the god of rain and life-giving water, and the other for Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. Life and death, side by side. To understand the Mexica, we must understand this duality. They believed their world was in constant peril. The sun, their primary deity, was engaged in an eternal battle against the darkness of night. To keep it moving across the sky, to ensure the dawn would come again, it required nourishment. This divine fuel was chalchihuatl, or precious water, the Mexica term for human blood. This was not sadism. As we observe the intricate rituals, we witness a society held captive by a terrifying cosmic obligation. They were the chosen people, tasked with the sacred duty of keeping the universe in motion. Every sacrifice was a deposit made to prevent cosmic bankruptcy. The priests, their hair matted with blood and their black robes stained, were not simply executioners. They were the guardians of existence itself. And the man who presided over this entire cosmic balancing act was the Emperor, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger. He was not a simple warlord. We see him as a deeply pious man, a scholar of his people's histories and omens, a god-king who lived in a state of gilded isolation. He ruled from a palace of breathtaking luxury, surrounded by hundreds of attendants who were forbidden from looking him in the face. Yet, his reign was troubled by a series of strange portents, comets blazing across the night sky, the temple of Huitzilopochtli bursting into flame, and whispers of a prophecy foretelling the return of another god, Quetzalcoatl, from the east. It is a chilling calculus we observe. The city's magnificent floating gardens, the chinampas, produced bountiful harvests. The aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland, a marvel of engineering. The markets overflowed with goods from 1,000 conquered towns. But every basket of maize, every brightly colored feather, every piece of jade was part of a transaction underwritten with terror. The Mexica elite lived in a state of profound security, but it was the security of a fortress built on a foundation of bones. They had mastered the mechanics of domination, but had never learned the language of allegiance. Now, in the year 1519, strange reports were beginning to trickle in from the coast. Fishermen spoke of floating mountains moving upon the water. Messengers brought drawings of men with skin as pale as foam, with hair on their faces like corn silk, who commanded thunder with metal sticks. A new wind was blowing from the east, and it carried the scent of steel and gunpowder. Those floating mountains did not simply vanish with the morning mist. As Moctezuma's court wrestled with the meaning of these omens, the gears of the empire continued to grind, fueled by that constant, insatiable need for human hearts. To truly grasp the fragility of this moment, we must turn our gaze from the coast and look inland, towards a small, defiant pocket of land that refused to bend the knee, the kingdom of Tlaxcala. Here, the empire's most peculiar and self-destructive institution was on full display. We are talking about the Xochiaoyotl, the Flower War. It sounds almost poetic, but its reality was a recurring nightmare, a formal, scheduled conflict with a chillingly specific purpose. This was not a war for territory or treasure. It was a harvest. Let us stand on the edge of one of these designated battlefields. We see two armies arrayed, not in the chaos of a desperate struggle, but with a strange, almost ceremonial order. The Mexica forces, adorned in the spectacular costumes of jaguar and eagle warriors, are a terrifying sight, but their goal today is not to annihilate the enemy. The primary weapon we see, the macuahuitl, is a wooden paddle edged with razor-sharp obsidian. It was a weapon perfectly designed to maim, to disable, to allow for a warrior to be taken alive. The purpose was to capture, not to kill. The Flower Wars were a dreadful pact, a way for the Mexica to obtain a steady stream of high-quality sacrificial victims and for their elite soldiers to gain combat experience. It was warfare as a managed resource, as predictable as the planting of maize. For the Mexica, this was a sacred obligation and a practical solution, but for their opponents, the Tlaxcalans, it was something else entirely. Imagine living with this for generations. You are encircled, economically strangled by an empire that could crush you but chooses not to. Instead, they use your people as a training ground for their warriors and a larder for their gods. Every young man knows that his destiny might be to have his chest carved open on an altar in Tenochtitlan. Here we find no honor in battle, only a grim and perpetual resistance. The Tlaxcalans became experts in a very specific kind of warfare, a defensive struggle for their very survival. Their hatred for the Mexica was not a political disagreement. It was forged in the blood of their captured sons and brothers. It was a hatred that burned with the heat of 1,000 suns. This is the great paradox we are witnessing. The very system designed to project Mexica power was also cultivating its own doom. The Flower Wars created a permanent enemy, a neighbor who was battle-hardened, intimately familiar with Mexica tactics, and consumed by a singular desire for revenge. The Mexica were so focused on the ritual that they failed to see the strategic poison they were drinking. They were tending a garden of hatred right on their own border, meticulously watering it with the blood of their captives. They believed this controlled violence kept the cosmos in balance, but on a human level, it was creating an imbalance of resentment so profound that it could never be corrected. The foundation of their empire was not just built on the bones of strangers, but on the enduring fury of their neighbors. And now, as the year 1519 unfolds, that fury is about to find its catalyst. The reports from the coast are becoming clearer, more detailed. The floating mountains have names. They are called caravels. The pale men are led by a man named Hernán Cortés. They have come ashore near the lands of the Totonacs, another people groaning under the weight of Mexica tribute. While Moctezuma sent emissaries bearing gifts of gold, hoping these strange beings might be gods, the Tlaxcalans saw something entirely different. They did not see the returning Quetzalcoatl. They saw a weapon, a strange, unpredictable, and potentially divine weapon that could finally be aimed at the heart of the empire that had tormented them for so long. The gods of the Mexica demanded blood, but the tide was bringing them something entirely new. As the Tlaxcalans began to sharpen their obsidian blades for a new kind of war, a very different scene was unfolding within the heart of the empire. Let us step inside the silent, incense-filled chambers of Moctezuma's palace in Tenochtitlan. Here, we are far from the grit of the battlefield. The walls are hung with intricate featherwork, and the air is heavy with the scent of copal and dread. The emperor, the Huey Tlatoani, the revered speaker for millions, was now a man who listened more than he spoke. His messengers, runners of incredible endurance, had returned not just with drawings, but with terrifyingly precise accounts. These newcomers were not gods in any simple sense. They ate common food, they slept, they bled when cut, and their personal hygiene was, by Mexica standards, appalling. Yet they rode upon giant hornless deer and commanded a fearsome, unnatural thunder. Here we witness a leader trapped not by enemy armies, but by the architecture of his own faith. Every decision Moctezuma made was filtered through a dense web of prophecy and divine obligation. And one prophecy in particular now echoed in every chamber of his court. The story of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the pale-skinned, bearded god of creation and knowledge. Centuries before, this benevolent deity had been tricked by his darker brother Tezcatlipoca, and sailed away to the east, vowing to return in a year called Se Acatl, 1 reed, to reclaim his throne. As fate would have it, the year 1519 was a 1 reed year. The coincidence was too perfect, too terrible to ignore. Was this man, Cortés, the herald of the returning god? Or was he something else, a mortal usurper merely cloaked in the legend's authority? This is where we see the fatal intersection of imperial arrogance and religious paralysis. Moctezuma's council was fractured. His most aggressive general, his own brother Cuitlahuac, urged a swift and overwhelming attack. Crush these interlopers on the coast before their mystique could poison the minds of the vassal states. It was the traditional Mexica response, the application of brute force that had built the empire. But Moctezuma hesitated. Attacking a god was unthinkable. It would invite cosmic ruin. Offending a powerful foreign king, on the other hand, was simply poor statecraft. So he chose a third path, a strategy of appeasement and deterrence that we can now recognize as a catastrophic miscalculation. He dispatched another embassy, this time laden with gifts of almost unimaginable value. Not just trinkets, but 2 massive discs, one of gold representing the sun, the other of silver for the moon, each as large as a cartwheel. The message, as Moctezuma intended it, was twofold. First, behold our wealth and power, understand that we are the masters of this land. Second, please take these treasures and go in peace. The effect on the Spaniards was precisely the opposite. The gifts did not satiate their appetite, they confirmed its object. They had stumbled upon a kingdom of staggering wealth, and its ruler seemed hesitant, almost frightened. Instead of turning their ships for home, the Spaniards burned them, signaling their absolute commitment. Every golden ornament Moctezuma sent was another nail in his empire's coffin. While he consulted the stars and interpreted the flight of birds, Cortés was on the ground, assessing the political landscape. He was quickly learning about the ocean of hatred that surrounded Tenochtitlan. He heard the stories of the Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, and dozens of other peoples. He was beginning to understand that he did not need to conquer an empire. He only needed to provide the spark that would cause it to consume itself. The great emperor, a prisoner in his own palace of prophecy, was about to receive guests. He had decided to welcome the strangers into his city, to see them with his own eyes, unaware that he was not inviting a god, but opening his gates to the end of his world. The gates to the Golden City were metaphorically swinging open, yet the road leading to Tenochtitlan was not paved with gold. It was a path built upon the grievances of 100 broken nations, and Hernán Cortés was about to walk it. Let us march alongside his small column of men, perhaps 400 Spaniards in total, as they leave the humid coast and venture into the heart of a continent they cannot begin to comprehend. They are a speck of dust in a vast and hostile landscape, outnumbered thousands to 1. By all logic, they should have been wiped from the face of the earth within weeks. But Cortés possessed a weapon far more potent than his cannons or his steel swords. He possessed the ability to listen. Their first significant stop is the city of Chempoala, the capital of the Totonac people. Here we find not a collection of primitive huts, but a thriving urban center with whitewashed temples and orderly streets, all shimmering in the oppressive heat. And here we also find the first open cracks in the empire's facade. The Totonac leader, a shrewd and corpulent man the Spaniards would nickname the Fat Chief, welcomes them with a calculated hospitality. He offers them food and lodging, all while his eyes assess these strange newcomers. He is not looking at gods. He is looking at an opportunity, a desperate gamble to throw off the yoke of his Mexica overlords. He speaks of the tribute, the endless demands for maize, cloth, and gold. More than that, he speaks with a quiet rage about his people, the sons and daughters taken to Tenochtitlan, never to return. What we witness next is a masterclass in political maneuvering that would have made Machiavelli proud. As if on cue, 5 of Moctezuma's imperial tribute collectors arrive in the city. We can see them now, striding through the marketplace with an air of absolute authority. Their hair is tied in a severe topknot, a mark of their station, and they carry fragrant flowers to ward off the stench of the common folk. They do not ask for the tribute, they demand it, and they add a new price for the Totonac's unsanctioned hospitality to the foreigners, 20 young men and women for the sacrificial stone. It is in this moment of palpable terror that Cortés makes his move. He turns to the trembling Totonac chief and gives him a simple, world-shattering suggestion. Arrest them. To lay hands on the emissaries of the revered speaker was an act of rebellion so profound it was almost unthinkable. It was a death sentence for the entire Totonac nation. Yet, with the Spaniards standing as armed witnesses, the impossible happens. The people of Cempoala, emboldened by this bizarre new power in their midst, seize the Mexica officials. The spell of invincibility is broken. Cortés, playing both sides with breathtaking audacity, then secretly allows 2 of the collectors to escape, sending them back to Moctezuma with a message that he, Cortés, was a friend and had nothing to do with this indignity. He was not just an invader. He was introducing the poison of chaos into the empire's bloodstream. For the Totonacs, there was no turning back. They had committed the ultimate sin, and their only hope for survival was to hitch their fate to these bearded strangers. Suddenly, Cortés's tiny army was not so tiny anymore. Thousands of Totonac warriors, burning with a generation of repressed fury, joined his cause. The news of this defiance spread like wildfire through the coastal lowlands. Other towns, long groaning under the weight of tribute, saw a flicker of hope. The Spaniards were no longer an isolated band of adventurers. They were the tip of a spear now wielded by the simmering rage of the coastlands, and it was aimed squarely at the unbowed heart of the resistance, the kingdom of Tlaxcala. The thick, soupy air of the coast gives way to a thin, sharp chill as we climb into the highlands. The path towards the heart of the resistance is a steep one, leading us into the fiercely independent domain of Tlaxcala. Cortés and his new Totonac allies march into a landscape that feels like a different world, one of jagged peaks and stark, windy plains. There are no welcoming parties here. Instead, they are greeted by a monumental sight, a great wall stretching for miles across the valley, a formidable stone barrier marking the edge of Tlaxcalan territory. This is not the architecture of a people accustomed to peace. It is a declaration carved in stone, a testament to a century of defiance against the empire that surrounds them. Here we witness a crucial test, one that will determine the fate of the entire expedition. The Tlaxcalans have seen empires come and go. They are not easily impressed by a few hundred strangers, regardless of their pale skin or their strange beasts. What unfolds is not a simple negotiation, but a brutal, bloody interview for the position of ally. The initial Spanish overtures of peace are answered with a storm of obsidian-tipped arrows and sling stones that whistle through the air like angry hornets. The Tlaxcalans descend upon the small Spanish Totonac force not as a disorganized mob, but as disciplined squadrons of warriors, their banners waving, their commanders directing the flow of battle with piercing whistles. They have fought the Mexica to a standstill for generations. These few foreigners are just a new and curious challenge. For several days, the Spaniards are locked in a desperate struggle for survival. We can see the sheer shock on their faces as they face an enemy unlike any they have known. These are not the easily intimidated coastal tribes. The Tlaxcalan warriors fight with a suicidal bravery, attempting to drag the armored horses to the ground with their bare hands, their macuahuitl clubs hacking at steel armor with ferocious power. The Spanish cannons carve bloody lanes through their ranks, but more warriors pour in to fill the gaps. At night, the Spaniards huddle in their makeshift camp, listening to the taunts and war cries from the darkness, tending to their wounds, and surely questioning the sanity of this entire endeavor. They are a tiny island of steel in an ocean of indigenous fury. Yet, as the fighting rages, a fierce debate is taking place within the Tlaxcalan capital. We can almost hear the arguments echoing in their senate. The younger, more aggressive general, Xicotencatl the Younger, sees the newcomers as nothing more than invaders, another threat to be exterminated. But his father, the elder statesman of the same name, and others see something more. They have received reports of the Spaniards' actions in Chempoala. They have heard how these men defied the Mexica tribute collectors. These strangers fight with a terrifying effectiveness. They do not break, and most importantly, they bleed. They are not gods, but they are potent, and their enemy is the same. The Tlaxcalans realize they are not just testing a potential invader, they are auditioning a weapon. After nearly 2 weeks of relentless combat, having proven they could not be easily broken, the Spaniards receive a new kind of emissary. Not warriors, but diplomats. The Tlaxcalans, their curiosity satisfied and their respect earned in blood, have made a decision. They will not destroy this strange new force. They will adopt it. Cortés and his exhausted men are finally welcomed into the city of Tlaxcala, not as conquerors, but as honored guests, and, more importantly, as the answer to a prayer they never knew they had uttered. A fatal bargain has been struck. The most determined enemies of the Mexica have now joined forces with the most technologically advanced one, creating a hybrid army of vengeance that Moctezuma, in all his prophetic dread, could never have imagined. The road to Tenochtitlan was no longer a path of conquest, it had become a river of retribution. Let us now march with this strange procession, a force that was a living contradiction. A few hundred Spaniards, their steel armor glinting under the high Mexican sun, formed the hard, sharp point of the spear. But the shaft of that spear was now composed of thousands upon thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, their faces painted for war, their hearts burning with a hatred a century in the making. The air crackled with a new kind of energy, an alliance born not of friendship but of a shared and consuming animosity. News of their approach traveled faster than the army itself, a shockwave of disbelief and fear that rippled all the way to Moctezuma's throne. His strategy of appeasement had failed. His enemies were now allied with these otherworldly beings, and they were coming for him. As we crest the final mountain pass, the Valley of Mexico unfolds below us like a divine map. And there, in the center of a vast shimmering lake, sits the impossible, Tenochtitlan. Even the most jaded of Cortés's men, veterans of the Italian wars and the Reconquista, were struck dumb by the sight. It was not a city, it was a vision, a jewel box of white temples and sprawling palaces connected to the shore by 3 immense causeways. This was the heart of the fear, the source of the power that had bled their new allies for generations, and it was more magnificent than any of them could have possibly imagined. It was a sight meant to intimidate, to scream of divine right and unassailable power. But to the Tlaxcalans, it was simply the nest they had long dreamed of burning. The 8th of November, 1519. We are standing on the great causeway of Iztapalapa, a thoroughfare so wide that 8 horsemen could ride abreast. Thousands of citizens line the route, their faces a mixture of awe, suspicion, and fear as this hybrid army marches towards their gates. And then we see him, carried on a litter adorned with quetzal feathers and hammered gold, shaded by a canopy of green plumage. Moctezuma emerges to greet the strangers. He is not the cowering, indecisive ruler of Spanish legend. He is the Huitlatoni, the embodiment of an empire, his every move steeped in ritual and authority. He descends from his litter, and for the first time, the old world and the new stand face to face. It is a moment frozen in a silent mutual appraisal, a collision of 2 universes contained in the gaze between a Spanish adventurer and a king revered as a god. What we witness next is the beginning of the great deception. Through his interpreters, a shipwrecked Spaniard named Aguilar and a brilliant Nahua noblewoman named Malintzin, Cortés offered greetings of peace from a distant king. Moctezuma, in turn, welcomed him with a flowery, fatalistic speech that seemed to acknowledge the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl. He offered them gifts, golden necklaces draped around their necks, and then made a gesture that sealed his fate. He invited the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan guard into the city, not as captives, not as enemies, but as honored guests. He would house them in the palace of Tlaxcalans, his own father's former residence, a vast compound right in the heart of the city next to the sacred precinct itself. It was an act of supreme hospitality or a strategic blunder of cosmic proportions. Cortés and his men walked into a gilded cage. They were surrounded by unimaginable wealth, attended by servants and treated with a deference that bordered on worship. Yet, as we watch them explore their new quarters, we can sense their profound unease. They were in the center of a metropolis of hundreds of thousands of warriors. The Tlaxcalans, their only true allies, were a volatile and hated presence in the city. Every polite gesture from their Mexica hosts felt like a veil over a hidden threat. The Spaniards had walked into the jaws of the beast, and the initial hospitality felt less like a welcome and more like the moment a serpent allows a mouse into its coils before the inevitable squeeze. The gilded cage had walls of politeness and bars of suspicion. Within the sprawling palace of Tlaxcalans, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies lived in a state of surreal tension. Here we can sense the profound culture clash playing out not in open battle, but in the silent spaces between words. We see Tlaxcalan warriors, their faces scarred from 100 battles against the Mexica, walking through the central market of Tlatelolco under Spanish protection. They stare with open contempt at the city's splendors built with the blood and treasure of their people. The Mexica merchants, in turn, look through them, their expressions a mask of civility that barely conceals a deep and abiding venom. This was not an alliance. It was a lit fuse, and the Spaniards were living right on top of it. Hernán Cortés was a man who understood leverage better than anyone. He knew his position was untenable. He and his men were guests, but also de facto prisoners, living on the emperor's charity in the heart of a city that could swallow them whole. We observe him pacing the palace courtyard, a predator trapped in a jeweled box, calculating his next move. He did not need an army to conquer this place. He needed to seize the source of its authority. His gaze kept returning to Moctezuma's own palace across the square, the center of the web. The key was not to destroy the web, but to capture the spider. An opportunity, a pretext, was all he required, and the simmering empire soon provided it. News arrived like a thrown spear, carried by exhausted Totonac runners from the coast. A Mexica lord, acting on what he claimed were Moctezuma's orders, had attacked the small Spanish garrison left behind at Veracruz. Several Spaniards had been killed, their severed heads sent as a grisly trophy to Tenochtitlan, proof that these strange invaders were, after all, mortal. For Cortés, this was not a disaster. It was a gift. It was the justification he had been praying for, the perfect reason to transform a visit into a hostage situation. He gathered his most trusted captains, their steel breastplates polished, their swords sharpened, their faces set like stone. The time for pleasantries was over. Let us follow them as they stride across the great plaza, a small, determined knot of about 30 armed men. They enter Moctezuma's palace, not as guests, but as accusers. The air in the throne room is thick with incense and the silent shock of the assembled Mexican nobility. Cortés, through his interpreter Malintzin, laid out the charges, his voice calm but with an edge of cold steel. He accused the emperor of ordering the attack, of treachery. Moctezuma, a man who had never been spoken to with such directness, denied it with all the regal authority he could muster. But Cortés was not there for a debate. He made his demand, a proposal so audacious, so insulting, it was almost beyond comprehension. The Huey Tlatoani must leave his own palace and come live with the Spaniards in the palace of Tlaxcalans, as a guest, of course, to ensure no further misunderstandings. We are witnessing the fulcrum on which an empire turns. The room held its breath. Moctezuma's nobles looked ready to tear the Spaniards apart with their bare hands. The emperor himself was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to unleash his jaguar warriors and the chilling, persistent fear that these men were agents of cosmic destiny. He argued, he protested, he offered his own sons as hostages instead. But the Spaniards were immovable. One captain, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, spoke in a low growl, suggesting they could end this conversation quickly. In that moment, something broke within the emperor. After hours of agonizing debate, the revered speaker of the Mexica Empire, the living God on earth, agreed to become a prisoner in his own city. He was escorted from his home, a sovereign ruler walking willingly into captivity, leaving behind a court and a people utterly bewildered, their universe suddenly and terrifyingly tilted on its axis. The illusion of divine authority proved to be a surprisingly durable cage. For months, a strange and fragile peace settled over Tenochtitlan. Here we observe Cortés playing the part of a master puppeteer, ruling an empire of millions through its captive king. Moctezuma, ever the gracious host and prisoner, issued decrees, collected tribute, and calmed his restless nobles, all under the watchful eyes of his Spanish keepers. Inside the palace of Axayacatl, we can almost hear the rhythmic clang of hammers as Spanish soldiers, hungry for gold, melted down centuries of exquisite Mexica artistry. Intricate statues of gods and delicate animal figures, objects of immense spiritual value, were rendered into crude, transportable bars. This was not just theft, it was the sacrilegious transformation of a people's soul into crude bullion. This precarious balance, however, was about to be shattered by a threat not from the Mexica, but from Cortés's own countrymen. A new Spanish fleet had arrived on the coast, led by Pánfilo de Narváez, with orders not to reinforce the conquerors, but to arrest them. Cortés, a man who never shied from a gamble, made a daring choice. He would take the bulk of his soldiers and march to the coast to confront this rival, leaving a garrison of around 150 men in Tenochtitlan to guard the emperor and the treasure. Let us now turn our attention to the man left in charge, Pedro de Alvarado. A striking figure with blonde hair that earned him the Nahuatl nickname Tonatiuh, the Sun, Alvarado was a capable soldier but a disastrous diplomat. He was a man with the sun in his hair and fire in his veins, who saw not celebration but conspiracy in every shadow. And a great celebration was approaching. The festival of Tlaxcalans, one of the most important ceremonies in the Mexica calendar, was a month-long affair honoring Tezcatlipoca. The Mexica nobility, with Moctezuma's permission, asked Alvarado for leave to hold the central dance in the courtyard of the great temple. Alvarado agreed, but his paranoia, fed by rumors from his Tlaxcalan allies, festered. He saw the gathering of thousands of unarmed nobles and warriors dressed in their finest feathers and jewels, not as an act of faith, but as the prelude to an uprising. He decided to strike first. We are now witnesses to one of the most infamous and short-sighted atrocities of the entire conquest. As the drumming reached a crescendo and the flower-decked dancers filled the sacred precinct, Alvarado gave the signal. He sealed the exits. The sacred drumming was answered not by celestial favor, but by the cold kiss of Spanish steel. The Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies fell upon the unarmed celebrants with a methodical butchery. Imagine the scene. A religious ecstasy transformed in an instant into a bloodbath. The great courtyard, a place of worship, became a slick abattoir. It was a tactical success and a strategic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The spell of Spanish invincibility, already cracked, was now utterly shattered. When news of the massacre spread, the city's grief turned instantly to a white-hot, unified rage. The docile population erupted. The drumming of the festival was replaced by the deep booming beat of the great serpent skin drum atop the Templo Mayor, the sound of a city calling itself to war. Cortés, having defeated Narváez and absorbed his army, returned to Tenochtitlan to find not a pacified city, but a hornet's nest he had personally kicked. The streets were silent and empty, the bridges over the canals raised. A hail of stones and arrows greeted him as he fought his way back to the besieged palace. The great deception was over. They were trapped. Days of brutal street fighting followed. Even forcing Moctezuma onto the palace roof to speak to his people only resulted in the emperor being struck down by a stone from his own subjects. With their puppet king dead and their supplies dwindling, the Spaniards' only option was a desperate nighttime escape. On the 30th of June, 1,520, under the cover of a rainstorm, they tried to flee. Each man was weighed down with as much gold from the melted treasure as he could carry, but the city was awake, and it was waiting. The flight became a frantic, suffocating struggle in the cold, dark water of the canals. Men, weighed down by the very gold they had killed for, sank without a sound, while Mexica warriors in thousands of canoes swarmed them from all sides. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The gold was at the bottom of the lake, the city had reclaimed its fury, and the war for this world had only just begun.